In this episode, we tackle a skill that sounds dramatic, but is actually a calm, practical way to make better security decisions. Impact analysis using extreme-but-plausible scenarios. Beginners sometimes imagine risk work as guessing scary disasters, but good impact analysis is not about fear, and it is not about predicting the future perfectly. It is about understanding what would happen to your organization if something important went wrong, so you can prioritize protections and recovery plans that make sense. SecurityX cares about impact analysis because security is always a trade-off between limited time, limited money, and many possible problems. If you can't estimate impact, you can't prioritize. And if you can't prioritize, you end up doing random security activities that feel busy but don't reduce the risks that would actually hurt you. Extreme but plausible means the scenario is serious enough to matter, but realistic enough that it could happen without requiring movie villain assumptions. We are going to learn how to build these scenarios, what to measure, how to avoid common mistakes like fantasy risks and tiny risks, and how to translate scenario thinking into clear security priorities that would show up in exam questions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Impact analysis starts with separating two ideas that beginners often mash together: likelihood and impact. Likelihood is how probable something is, while impact is how bad it would be if it happened. A lightning strike is low likelihood for many organizations, but it can be high impact if it takes down a critical data center. A weak password might be higher likelihood and also high impact if it leads to account takeover. Security programs need both perspectives, but impact analysis is mainly about the second one. What are the consequences? If you only think about likelihood, you might ignore rare events that would be catastrophic. If you only think about impact, you might spend all your energy on doomsday events and ignore daily threats that slowly bleed the organization. Extreme but plausible scenarios help you balance these by making you consider meaningful harm without drifting into fantasy. On SecurityX, questions often describe a situation where an organization has to decide what to protect first, what to restore first, or what risks deserve attention. If you can think in terms of impact, you can answer those questions with a clear rationale instead of guessing based on which option sounds most technical. To build a useful scenario, you need an anchor, which is the business function or asset that matters, not the technology itself. Beginners often start with a technical event like server crash, but impact analysis is stronger when it starts with what the organization needs to do. For example, a hospital needs to deliver patient care, a retailer needs to process payments, and a manufacturer needs to operate production lines. Technology supports those functions, and the impact of a security event is measured in how those functions are disrupted. Once you pick the anchor, you imagine a plausible extreme disruption to that function, like widespread loss of access to systems, corruption of critical data, or a major leak of sensitive information. The scenario becomes extreme because it affects a core function, and plausible because it uses realistic failure modes. The exam likes this approach because it ties security back to mission outcomes, which is what governance and risk management are supposed to do. If a scenario is framed around business disruption, your answer should not be purely technical. It should reflect the organizational impact and the priority of restoring critical functions. Now let's talk about what makes a scenario plausible, because this is where beginners either undershoot or overshoot. A plausible scenario uses known patterns: credential theft, ransomware, misconfiguration, insider mistakes, third-party outages, and data exfiltration are all realistic patterns. A less plausible scenario might require a perfect chain of unlikely events, like an attacker simultaneously compromising every system without detection in a way that ignores basic security controls. Extreme but plausible scenarios often involve compound effects, like a ransomware event that not only encrypts files, but also disrupts authentication, or a cloud outage that also breaks your monitoring and incident response tooling. Those compound effects are plausible because dependencies exist, and dependencies are where real incidents get messy. The scenario should also match the organization's context. If your company doesn't run physical plants, a scenario about industrial control systems might be less relevant. On SecurityX, you may be asked to perform impact thinking without a specific industry, so you focus on universal assets like identity systems, customer data, financial processes, and core service availability. Plausibility comes from matching common architectures and common failure patterns, not from inventing a once-in-a-century event. Once you have a scenario, impact analysis asks you to measure consequences in categories that leaders can understand and that security teams can act on. You can think about impact in at least 4 broad areas: operational impact, financial impact, legal and regulatory impact, and reputational impact. Operational impact is what stops working, like inability to take orders, inability to authenticate users, or inability to access critical records. Financial impact includes direct losses like downtime costs, recovery costs, and lost revenue, plus indirect costs like productivity loss. Legal and regulatory impact includes obligations to notify, potential penalties, and contract breaches. Reputational impact includes loss of customer trust, negative media coverage, and long-term brand damage. You do not need exact numbers to do this well. You need relative severity and time sensitivity. The exam often tests time sensitivity, like what is the impact if an outage lasts 1 hour versus 1 day versus 1 week. Thinking in categories helps you answer because you can explain why certain controls or recovery priorities matter. For example, restoring identity services quickly might be critical because everything else depends on authentication. That is impact analysis guiding priorities. Time is a crucial dimension in impact analysis, and it is often the difference between a vague scenario and a useful one. Some impacts are immediate, like a payment system outage that stops revenue. Some impacts grow over time, like a data leak that triggers investigations and long-term trust loss. When you build extreme but plausible scenarios, you should think about the timeline. What breaks first, what breaks next, and what becomes impossible after a certain point. This timeline approach helps you identify dependencies. If your ticketing system is down, your support teams may not be able to manage incident communications. If your email is down, your ability to coordinate may suffer. If your backups are also impacted, recovery might take far longer. SecurityX questions often describe incidents with cascading effects, and the best answers often involve prioritizing the restoration of systems that enable recovery itself. That can sound abstract, but the logic is straightforward. You want to restore the tools and services that let you restore everything else. A timeline perspective also helps you choose the right response category, like immediate containment, rapid service restoration, or longer-term remediation. Let's address the word extreme, because it can lead beginners to choose unrealistic extremes or to assume the scenario must be apocalyptic. Extreme in this context means meaningful disruption, not total destruction. A useful extreme scenario might be the complete loss of a critical service for a day, or a major breach of a sensitive dataset, or a compromise of privileged accounts that affects multiple systems. These are extreme because they threaten core operations, but they are not fantasy because they happen in the real world. The point is that mild scenarios often lead to mild controls, and mild controls may not hold up under stress. By testing your program against a more severe scenario, you can identify weak points that would otherwise stay hidden. For the exam, this connects to business continuity and disaster recovery thinking, where you plan for disruptive events, not just minor hiccups. If a question asks how to prioritize investments or which scenarios should drive planning, extreme but plausible is often the right framing because it ensures planning is meaningful without being ridiculous. There are also common mistakes that make impact analysis less useful, and being able to spot them helps on the exam. One mistake is focusing on the wrong asset, like protecting a minor internal tool while ignoring a core system. Another mistake is ignoring dependencies, which leads to a plan that looks good on paper but fails during a real incident. A third mistake is assuming perfect response, like assuming incident response will work flawlessly even though the tools it relies on might be down. Another mistake is treating impact as a single number without explaining what it means, because leaders need context to make decisions. A final mistake is letting fear drive the scenario, leading to improbable threats that distract from real risks. On SecurityX, distractor answers often lean into one of these mistakes, such as choosing a plan that protects something non-critical or proposing a control that sounds strong but doesn't address the scenario's real impact drivers. If you practice spotting these mistakes, you will get better at choosing the best answer even when multiple options sound plausible. Impact analysis also feeds directly into control selection and prioritization, which is where the work becomes actionable. Once you identify high-impact scenarios, you ask what controls reduce the likelihood and what controls reduce the impact. Reducing likelihood includes preventive measures like access controls and hardening. Reducing impact includes resilience measures like backups, segmentation, and incident response preparedness. Beginners often focus only on prevention, but mature security includes the assumption that some attacks will succeed. So you plan to limit blast radius and speed up recovery. An extreme but plausible scenario often reveals where impact reduction is the most valuable. For example, you may not be able to prevent every phishing attempt, but you can reduce impact by limiting privileges, monitoring for unusual behavior, and having rapid account recovery processes. On the exam, if you see a question that asks what to do first to improve readiness for a high-impact scenario, answers that reduce blast radius and improve recovery are often strong, especially when prevention alone is unrealistic. To make scenario thinking easier, it helps to use a simple structure: trigger, scope, consequences, and decision. The trigger is the initiating event, like credential compromise or ransomware. The scope is which systems, data, and users are affected. The consequences are the operational and business impacts over time. The decision is what you would prioritize to reduce harm. This structure helps you avoid getting stuck in dramatic storytelling and keeps you focused on decision-making. You can apply it quickly in your head during exam questions. If the question describes a trigger and scope, you can infer likely consequences and choose the decision that best reduces those consequences. If the question asks for the best scenario to use in planning, you choose one that has a plausible trigger, a meaningful scope, and clear consequences that justify controls. The structure also helps you avoid a trap where you pick a scenario that is extreme but not instructive. A good scenario teaches you something about weaknesses and priorities. A bad scenario just scares you without pointing to specific improvements. As we wrap up, the key idea is that impact analysis is how you make security priorities defensible because it connects technical events to business outcomes and time-sensitive consequences. Extreme but plausible scenarios help you avoid planning for either nothing or everything, and they push you to consider dependencies, cascading effects, and realistic response constraints. When you build scenarios anchored in critical functions, measure impact across operational, financial, legal, and reputational dimensions, and think through timelines, you get a clearer picture of what truly matters. That clarity helps you choose controls that reduce both likelihood and impact, and it helps you explain priorities in a way that makes sense to leadership. For SecurityX, this mindset turns scenario questions into solvable puzzles. Identify the asset, understand the consequence, and choose the action that best reduces meaningful harm. When you can do that calmly, you are not just preparing for the exam, you are learning a way of thinking that makes security decisions smarter, more consistent, and far less random.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.